everyone for joining us tonight. I'm Rebecca Alabone, a longtime member of 350 NYC, and I'll be your host for this evening's webinar, The Way Forward on Climate and Agricultural Policy. Thanks for joining us. This webinar is sponsored by Earthjustice, 350 NYC, and 350 Chicago. Just a quick note, there'll be a Q&A following the presentation. Throughout the webinar, we'll be putting links in the chat, but if you have any questions for the speaker during the presentation, please be sure to leverage the Q&A section of the webinar. Thank you. Also, tonight's webinar will be recorded and sent to everyone who's registered. Now I'm excited to introduce you to our speaker tonight, Peter Lehner. Peter's the managing attorney of the Sustainable Food and Farming program at Earthjustice, the country's largest nonprofit public interest environmental law firm. The FF program develops and deploys strategies to promote a more just, environmentally sound, and climate resilient agricultural system to help reduce the health, environmental, and climate harms from the production of our food. Peter is one of the leading experts on the impact of agriculture and climate change and is the author of Farming for Our Future, the Science, Law, and Policy of Climate Neutral Agriculture. And Peter is also a farmer. So from 2007 to 2015, Peter was the executive director of the NRDC and the NRDC Action Fund. There he grew the organization, particularly the climate change and clean energy programs, and expanded the food system work. I'm thrilled to welcome Peter. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Peter.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, Rich. It's really great to be here. I've been an admirer of 350 for a very, very long time and worked with many different elements of 350 over the years. And so really wonderful to be here and talking about this. I want to first just start emphasizing what Rich said. The climate is a big fight, and anything you can do really matters. Like many of you, I've been working on climate change for a long time, perhaps longer than some. I think I brought one of the very first climate change lawsuits in 1988 when we challenged, get this, President Reagan's rollback of fuel efficiency standards. And now, of course, we're fighting President Trump's rollbacks of fuel efficiency standards. And in between, we fought President Bush's rollback of fuel efficiency standards. And like many of you probably, when I think about climate for a long, long time, I really focused on the power sector and to some extent transportation. After all, that's where a lot of fossil fuel emissions come from. And it's very easy to think that climate change means burning fossil fuels, largely coal, oil, and gas, and releasing CO2. And of course, that's a big part of climate change. But it's not the only part of climate change, and that's the part I will talk to you about tonight. I'm going to talk to you about agriculture's very, very significant contribution to climate change. And though agriculture is a tricky area, it's something that we all depend on. We eat food every day, and yet we don't really realize its impacts. I will focus on the climate impacts. But I started to focus on agriculture when I was working for the city of New York, and we were trying to protect our drinking water supply. And I quickly realized that some of the biggest threats to the upstate drinking water supply of New York City was actually farms, not power plants and not industrial facilities. I also learned that while the federal laws, the environmental laws, gave me a very good tool, me as just a young lawyer for the city, gave me a very powerful tool to address many types of pollution in the watershed of our drinking water supply. Those same tools were not very effective with agricultural pollution. So I learned at that side the dual lessons that agriculture has a big impact on our environment, and traditional environmental tools are not nearly as effective with agriculture as they are with industrial and power sector and even transmission emissions. So I then started paying more attention to agriculture and realized, wow, it also has an enormous impact on climate change. And it has an impact on climate change in ways that many may not understand, and yet we all should understand, because after all, food is something we deal with 3 times a day. Some of us more than 3 times a day. And those food choices can have tremendous environmental consequences. So let me get started. I will try to tell you a little bit about how agriculture contributes to climate change. I'll then talk to you about what we can do about it. Uh, and the good news is a lot can be done about that. The bad news is current policies do very little to encourage better a food system that is climate friendly, and frankly, in many ways, encourage a very climate unfriendly food system. So we need to change those policies, and in order to do that, we need your voice. So we'll talk about some of the important opportunities you may have moving forward. So I'm going to start by just sharing my screen, and I hope this will be helpful to you. Um, so uh, here we are. Welcome. It's great to have you. For some reason, the captions are showing. Sorry about that. I wasn't able to turn those off. So the first question is, let me see here. The first question is, where do these agricultural emissions come from? And the answer is cows, corn, and crap. If you remember nothing else from tonight, I hope you can remember that. That will keep it very simple. As I said earlier, most of our climate change emissions come from the burning of fossil fuels and the release of carbon dioxide. And of course, there's some energy use in agriculture and in the food system. We use agricultural energy in our tractors, irrigation systems, the ventilation fans at animal operations. There's a lot of energy used in food processing as food gets processed and packaged and shipped from one part of the world to another. And then we use energy in our home. If you have your morning cup of coffee, somewhere between a third and a half of the climate impact of your morning cup of coffee is just boiling your water for the coffee. But overall, that carbon dioxide coming from energy is a relatively small part of the food system's contribution to climate change. The biggest system impacts come from, as I said, cows, their feed, and their waste, and all the land that those animals in our agricultural system uses. So let's start with the cows. I start with cows because cows are unlike other animals that we deal with, including ourselves. They are belching methane all the time. And I'm sure everybody on this call knows that methane is a very potent greenhouse gas, about 28 or 30 times more powerful over 100 years than carbon dioxide, and about 80 times more powerful than carbon dioxide over 20 years. And but you may not know is cows actually emit more methane than the oil and gas sector. That's a lot of methane coming from cows belching. And in addition to that, and hopping a little bit ahead, all those cows, and frankly, all the other animals, the beef cows, the dairy cows, the pigs, and the chicken, produce a lot of waste. And that waste, as it sits around, often in manure lagoons that many of you may have heard about, uh, also releases a lot of methane. But in addition, going back to the cows, cows use a lot of land. You may think of cows in a feedlot, but for every cow in a feedlot, you've got about 4 cows at earlier stages of their life grazing. So even though most of our cows are not grass finished, they're finished on grain in a feedlot, they start their lives grazing. And all that grazing uses a tremendous amount of land, as we'll see in the next slide. So between their belching methane, they're producing a lot of waste, and their use of a tremendous amount of land. Cows are a very significant, I should say cattle, because it's not dairy cows and beef cattle, are a very important part of agriculture's contribution. Now, all of those animals, the cattle, the dairy cows, the pigs, and the chickens, they eat a lot. And most of what they eat is grain, largely corn and soy and similar grains. that is produced on large scale crops that are very heavily dependent on nitrogen fertilizer. Now, nitrogen fertilizer makes things grow, but you may not know that on average, the farmers put about twice as much fertilizer on their crops as the plant can actually take up. Now, that excess fertilizer does not just vanish. Much of it runs off into the water, causing dead zones, eutrophic lakes. If it gets into the groundwater, it can cause health challenges like blue baby syndrome. But some of it also goes up into the air as nitrous oxide, a greenhouse gas that's about 300 times more powerful than carbon dioxide, and also one of the most powerful ozone depleters. So we use a lot of land to produce feed for animals, and that produces a lot of nitrous oxide. That alone is about 5, 6, 7% of US greenhouse gas emissions. When we produce rice, we also release a lot of other both methane and nitrous oxide. And again, as I said, you have all of this land that has been converted from native prairies or forests to produce feed for all these animals that we eat. And I say all these animals, by the way, we in this country slaughter about 18,000 animals a minute for food. So that's 18,000 animals that had a whole life before they were slaughtered. And during that time, they ate a lot of food and they pooped a lot. And that's why the third category of impact is from their animal waste, is from their waste. And that, as I said earlier, releases a lot of nitrous oxide and methane. It's often spread on fields where it further releases nitrous oxide and methane. And also when it rains, sometimes runs in the water, causing tremendous water pollution all around the country. And then there's other ways that our waste affects from the food system, affects climate change. Most significantly, the fact that we waste about 30% of the food we produce, 35% in different ways. And most of that goes to a landfill where it rots and releases methane. So all of that means we are producing in our food system a tremendous amount of both carbon dioxide, as I said, from energy and from chemical production and the like, methane, a very potent greenhouse gas from cows and their waste and rice production, and nitrous oxide from the feed production that all these animals acquire. And one very significant aspect of climate change driven by agriculture is land use. And I think it's important to really focus on this for a minute because most other aspects of our economy really don't use much land. We may think they use a lot of land. You know, that's a lot of land in the roads, or a mine looks very, very big. But if you think of it globally, it's really not much land. The only sector of the economy that really uses a tremendous amount of land is agriculture. And as you see from this map, the vast majority of that is agricultural grazing largely for cattle. And you see that big graph in the middle of this slide. It is about 800 million acres, or about 40% of the contiguous US, we devote to grazing cattle. And then you see another of some of these big boxes that say livestock feed and feed exports. These are the lands that grow the corn and soy that I mentioned earlier, that is then fed to these animals. And this is actually surprisingly inefficient. It takes about 15 pounds of grain to get a pound of beef. So you have to use a lot of farmland in order to produce a pound of beef. First, a lot of grazing land, and then a lot of feed land. And you see other important elements here that I want to point out. There's a relatively small box, see if this works, that shows the food that we eat is a relatively small portion. It's big, of course, it's bigger. There's the state of Michigan. So it's still quite big in comparison to any others. But compare that to the land that indirectly becomes our feed. And then we have about 50 million acres of corn and soybean that goes into our gas tanks by ethanol and biodiesel. A tremendous waste of land, given that solar panels are about 300 times more efficient a use of land than growing corn or soybean to put into our gas tanks. All of this land could be sequestering carbon. All of this land had been converted from native lands that stored much more carbon. And when they were converted to pasture or cropland, lost all that carbon. And all of this land is now being used for purposes that essentially have and sequester very, very little carbon under current practices. So it's not only the loss of carbon when we first converted all that land, all of this agricultural land, but it's also the continuing loss of all that land in its natural ability to store carbon. So that's where how agriculture contributes to climate change. You put all of this together, and agriculture derives between about a quarter and a third of climate change. Now just pause and think about that. First of all, why the range? Why don't we know more? Well, often our agriculture system is very international. So do we include just the US agriculture, or how about all the 20% of the food that we import? And where exactly does our food system end? Does it include the processing? Does it include the boiling your water for your cup of coffee? So estimates and discussions of this will vary. But it's certainly fair, and many scientific studies make clear that agriculture, or if you want to say the food system more broadly, certainly drives about a third of climate change. And what that means is that even if we succeed in decarbonizing our energy and transportation system, if we don't change our food system, we will face catastrophic climate change. The food system alone can push us beyond any safe climatic level. We may be beyond that, of course, already. But even if we're not now, the food system alone can get there. So we have to think about how are we going to transform our food system to be climate neutral, to not be driving climate change the way it is driving climate change now. Now, climate change is also a funny thing with agriculture because unlike other sectors of the economy, agriculture is almost uniquely affected by climate change. Look, we're all affected by climate change for sure. Every sector of the economy is affected to some extent, but agriculture much, much more so than others. Agriculture depends on a constant weather pattern, and those weather patterns are changing. Agri-food or crops are grown in certain areas because that was good weather for that area. And now things are changing. It used to be we grew wheat in North Dakota, and now you can grow corn in North Dakota. So just overall patterns are changing. But also we're facing new challenges. You've all heard, I'm sure, of the very frequent the floods and the droughts. And if you're a farmer trying to raise something, whether it be animals or a crop, and your crop is now under 3 feet of water, or you haven't had water for 6 months, those are real challenges. Imagine also just straight heat can be very bad for crops. The fire, the smoke, all of these things can be real challenges. Some of the farms I manage have had to struggle with pests that we just didn't have 20 years ago, but they have come into the area because of climate change, because of new weather patterns allowing new fungus, new insects, new bugs, new weeds, and we have to deal with all of those. So climate change puts agriculture at great risk. Indeed, you may have seen President Obama's White House chef, Sam Kass, who just came out with a book called The Last Supper. And he talks about providing dinners for the Obamas and others, where he would, after presenting everyone a delicious meal, introduce the concept of the Last Supper, because many of the foods that he just served them wouldn't be available in 10 or 15 years. Wine is at risk, coffee is at risk, chocolate is at risk, many fish are at risk. All of these foods are at risk because of climate change. So that's the problem. Now we get to the good part. What can we do about this? The good news is we can do something about this. We can actually both grow our food or produce our food in different ways that will have much less of a climate impact. And we can also rethink what we are producing on this land, how we are using our land. So it's not a question of how we grow our food, but what food we're growing, what we're doing with the food we grow, what we do with the land that we have that is available to grow. And for those who might be interested, I won't go into this in great detail. There are books written on every one of these issues here. There's a lot of things that can be done. And the good news is there have been farmers out there, frankly, with very little policy support, who have adopted practices and proven that these practices can work to produce a lot of good food, often more nutritious food, in ways that are both more resilient to climate change and also reduce agriculture's contribution to climate change. As just this one example, take a look at these perennial crops. Perennial crops are crops that live from year to year versus annual crops like wheat and corn. As you can imagine, wheat and corn have very little roots. So they are much more susceptible to floods and droughts because they have less access to the ground and they store a lot less carbon. A perennial plant, as you see from this picture, has much, much more root mass, which makes them more resilient and is storing a lot more carbon. And there's lots of other things we can do. We can use our fertilizer more carefully. We can think about which plants we're planting, which crops we're planting, how we manage rice, how we manage the grazing. We can put trees into or around pasture land and cropland, often producing other crops that can be very, very productive. We can manage that manure, the crap I mentioned earlier, in ways that produce a lot less methane. So these are all possible. And the good news is we have a good sense that they work and how they can be implemented. The bad news is they're only implemented on a tiny portion of American farmland. And we actually haven't done that much study of them. We owe a great debt of gratitude to the farmers and ranchers that have been using these practices, but they have actually been starved for research. So we could actually, with the type of research government puts into many other areas, we could develop these practices and make them even better. And then we can use policies to try to implement them, not on 3% of American cropland, but on 93% of American cropland. So how do we do that? How do we get these types of practices employed far more broadly? Well, there's a lot of things we can do. One is we can simply address our pollution laws. Right now, our pollution laws largely exclude agriculture, and so they provide very little incentive for agriculture to address their agricultural emissions. So for example, take an animal feedlot called a CAFO sometimes, a concentrated animal feeding operation, where you may have thousands, tens of thousands, or maybe even 1 million animals crammed together in a building. And their waste goes into a lagoon, which, as I mentioned, produces a lot of methane. That's one of the largest sources of methane in the country, and it is not covered by any environmental law for the most part. And as a result, there's very little incentive, really no incentive for a operator to try to reduce those methane emissions. The nitrous oxide emissions from all that cropland that I mentioned, 400 million acres of cropland almost, there's nothing that regulates that. There's no incentive to try to reduce those nitrous oxide emissions. Very little support given to farmers to reduce those nitrous oxide emissions. So one key possibility, like we've done with other sectors of the economy, is say, hey, this greenhouse gas emissions are not good. We want to try to discourage them through regulatory reporting, oversight, and limits. All of that is possible. Politically, it's a challenge, but it is certainly legally possible. And there's, to some extent, some of that is done in other countries. So it's certainly possible in different politics to be done here. I mentioned all that grazing land. There's about 800 million acres of land used for grazing, 40% of the US. About 250 million of that is federal land. That's land owned by you and me. And right now, that land is often managed in a way that is very harmful from a biodiversity perspective, a water quality perspective, and a climate perspective. In fact, there were just a lawsuit filed recently by some environmental groups challenging poor grazing, poor land management of some federal land out west uh, for exactly this, for not being managed in a way to minimize erosion, climate, carbon loss, and biodiversity loss. Unfortunately, of course, in this administration, things are just the opposite. Today, Secretary of Agriculture Brooke Rollins announced a package of reforms to supposedly increase our cattle herd in the United States, including reducing grazing oversight and regulations on grazing, which is unfortunate. Frankly, we can talk more about any of these in the Q&A, but we've had 150 years of overgrazing in this country, and unfortunately, that seems to be getting worse. But it would be possible with the right political pressure from you and others to do something much better. You may not have heard of the Farm Bill, but you're a smart group, and so you're probably some of the few Americans who have heard of the Farm Bill. That's an unusual bill that every 5 years, normally, in normal times, is renewed and provides a tremendous amount of support to the farm community. It also provides many, many billions of dollars for nutrition assistance, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance or SNAP program. And you probably have read a lot about that. But the focusing on the farm programs, those now provide what is sometimes called the safety net. And that safety net, what is here on the slide called the commodity and crop insurance programs, are actually so designed that they actually encourage farmers to undertake often risky and harmful practices because they know that if things go great, they get all the benefit, and if things go bad, they will largely be protected from any downside. So we're already paying farmers on the order of $20 billion or more a year. Let's start spending that money and trying to get good climate practices from that rather than encouraging bad practices. But as I said earlier, it's not just changing how we grow our food. It's also what we do with the food and what we grow. Right now, we eat a diet that is very climate intensive. Beef is many, many times more climate intensive than plants, and frankly, or even other meat opportunities. We have a very high carbon footprint. It's like driving around a Hummer all the time. Moreover, of the food we produce, we waste about 40% of it. Most of it goes to a landfill, rots, but others of it is otherwise discarded. And all of the production of food that isn't eaten is, in a sense, a ridiculously wasted carbon impact, climate impact. So there's lots of ways we can change diets. It doesn't mean we're going to have some government agency telling you from the nanny state what to eat. There's a lot of ways, nudges that are possible to encourage people to think more carefully about their diet, to find alternatives, and to change what they're eating. One element of that, for example, is just telling the truth. We have a lawsuit where we're representing the environmental working group against Tyson, arguing that their claims that they are going to be net zero by 2050 and that they have a climate-friendly beef is greenwashing. And we argue that that claim by Tyson is just not at all supported by what they are doing or by technological or feasibility. What they're claiming is really just impossible. And yet they're trying to lull consumers into buying their beef with thinking it's good for the climate. So it's important to tell the truth so that consumers can make their choices. They can choose to buy with their values, knowing they have the right information. And there's lots of other things we can do. I mentioned earlier about biofuels, 60 million acres. That's about the equivalent of every inch of Illinois and Indiana combined being used to put fuel in our gas tanks. when instead of 60 million acres, we could use about 200,000 acres of solar panels going into electric vehicles and get the same transportation energy and have 59.8 million acres of land left over for doing good things, including sequestering carbon or feeding hungry people around the world. So lots of things we can do. Again, change how we grow our food, what we're doing with our food, and what we're doing with the land to ensure that we are using it from the most climate friendly way. So I tried to put all of this that I've just said into one simple slide that perhaps is useful to you. If you look at our agricultural greenhouse emissions, that's on the left of this slide. Uh, as I mentioned, it's animals and their feed. That's largely what's coming there. Enteric emissions, it's called. They're cows belching methane and their waste and their feed production. There's a certain amount of impact from food crops that we actually eat. So fruits and vegetables, wheat, and things that humans eat directly. A tremendous amount of land use impact that I mentioned earlier, and then all that processing, because it's a long way from a cornfield to your Doritos or whatever else you may be eating. And that has a tremendous impact. So what can we do about that? As I mentioned, one of the best practices we can do is add trees on the cropland and pasture land, because trees are great perennial crops. They can often actually nowadays be a tremendous way to help shade annual crops, which can be very helpful as it gets hotter and the weather gets more variable. We do that on a farm I manage, and that has made a big, big difference. All these lower greenhouse gas practices that I mentioned before, using both the nudges of the Farm Bill and pollution laws to create incentives for lowering emissions, can make a big difference in terms of lowering the emissions from what we're producing. We do have to think about all the time, yield is important, because if we want to produce the same amount of food and we want to do it on as little land as possible, because if it takes more land, we may have to cut down more forests, especially with the world population growing. And as it gets richer, it tends to eat more meat. So we have to make sure we are having a very efficient and effective food system. There's lots of things that I think of it as just plain stupid. And crop-based biofuels are one of those. The corn ethanol and soy-based diesel, food waste, a lot of processing systems are an industry that has been slow to clean up. Other industries have shifted more to renewable energy, but many food processing, whether it be dairy processing, fruit processing, meat processing, these tend to be frankly dirtier than average and slower to adopt clean energy practices that other industries have adopted. And that's in part because advocates like all of us have focused more on the big industries like steel or something rather than slaughterhouses. But we have to look at those as well. And there's something that you can make a difference of. You and at your school, in your home, in your every community you're in, shifting what you eat to more climate-friendly diets. For many people, the single most important thing they can do as an individual to reduce their climate footprint is to change their diet. Even more so than recycling or driving less or flying less or anything else, although flying less is going to be a big one. It's going to be changing your diet. And we have to acknowledge that we have a long way to go. Even if we did all of that on all applicable cropland, we still don't quite get there. So we need a lot more research. And right now, research is being cut. So we need energy to put more, to get more attention into this so we have some solutions. And that's where all of you come in. And I'm going to stop sharing now because that's my last slide. And one of the things that you can do is to speak up. It's really important. Environmental activists like 350 has been really important over the past decades to push public policy But most environmental activists really spend very, very little time on the food system. And so when, for example, I'm lobbying on the Farm Bill, the people I'm talking to haven't heard from very many people, other than the large scale industrial producers who they hear from a lot. They may hear from a lot of people on renewable energy ideas and clean transportation, but they don't hear from people about the importance of a clean food system, of an energy efficient, climate friendly food system. So it's really important to speak up on that at every chance you have, to your local government to think about what food they're providing to their school kids. Is it as climate friendly a diet as it can? To your state government, are you supporting climate friendly practices on your state's agricultural operations? Is the state measuring greenhouse gases? Uh, and at the federal level. And normally at the federal level, we'd have a farm bill that would be up for debate, and you could say, hey, let's make sure we use farm subsidies to support climate friendly practices. But because of the weird things going on in Congress right now, that's largely been taken off the table by the Republican reconciliation budget bill, the one big, beautiful bill, it's called, I think, although I hate to use that name. However, that same farm bill is potentially a vehicle for industrial agriculture proponents to prevent states from taking good action. And so I'm going to just close by urging you all to think about contacting your members in Congress, as well as don't forget your local government and your state government. Uh, but in Congress, really important, they hear from you that the federal government not preempt the states and localities from addressing environmental issues. There's bills in Congress now to prevent local governments from dealing with pesticides, from dealing with animal welfare, from dealing with food safety, all of these issues which are so important now, particularly with federal government dysfunction. So please speak up on that. And with that, I'll be happy to take any questions or have any conversation.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Peter. I'd like to bring Rich on as well to help me with the Q&A. As a reminder, please make sure you enter your questions in the Q&A section of the webinar. With that, I'm going to kick us off with one pre-submitted question. Peter, would love to know, please name one or two chief ways in which regenerative agriculture protects a good climate that is not met by organic agriculture.
Well, that actually opens up a real can of worms because regenerative agriculture, unlike organic agriculture, is not defined. Organic agriculture is very carefully defined by the National Organic Program. And if you want to get certified, you have to go meet certain standards that are very, very well established. Regenerative agriculture is right now a concept, a very good concept of, I think of it as trying to use biology, use Mother Nature to help us grow healthy, nutritious food in a way that helps build soil fertility and productivity, and keeps it healthy in the long run. But it's a big concept. And right now, it is not defined rigorously. There are some groups that have some standards for regenerative agriculture. One group, for example, I'm familiar with that deals not with US agriculture, but more tropical agriculture, the Rainforest Alliance. You may have seen their little frog on packages for certification of sustainability. They just released a regenerative agriculture standard that has 70 pages of detailed standards, and you need to be audited by a third party to get certified and use that certification. So that's one end. On the other hand, a company can just say, hey, my farmers claim they're using a bit of no-till, and no-till is one of the things we talk about in regenerative agriculture, so my food is regenerative. And nothing is illegal about that. I think it's misleading. It's highly misleading. But because regenerative isn't defined by any law or any program, a company can do that. And frankly, we have a lot of companies that are doing that, unfortunately, that are saying they want to get the consumer boost because consumers seem to be interested in regenerative agriculture, but we don't want to do the work of really changing our whole food system. So I mentioned that because what regenerative is a big, big question. Ultimately speaking, the question is what was good about regenerative that may be different about organic. Organic, again, by the way, there's a range of that. There's now regenerative organic, there's real organic, and there's organic. But traditionally it tends to focus more on chemical use, whereas regenerative is focusing more on soil practices, soil health practices. Now, by and large, organic practices will be very good for soil health. But there are ways you can be very good for soil health without going all the way organic. Organics is no pesticides, and for the most part, no synthetic pesticides. Maybe you can use a little bit of synthetic pesticides, a little bit of synthetic fertilizer, but do it really well and really carefully and be legitimately and truly regenerative, and be terrific for soil health, but not quite reach to organic. So those are the types of ways you can make a difference. I think some of the opportunities are also rotating your crops more. Just rotating your crops. Imagine if you have one crop, you use the same every year, the same crop. The bugs that like that crop just every year get more and more and more. So you have to use more and more pesticide to fight those bugs. And the soil is being depleted of whatever that crop likes because every year it's being pulled, the same stuff is being pulled out of the soil. If you rotate your crops every, say, on a 3 or 4 year cycle, the bugs that like one crop will die off of the other years. The nutrients that you pull out one year might get restored by the other crops. So simply something like a crop rotation can mean you use less fertilizer. And remember, fertilizer releases nitrous oxide, which is a potent greenhouse gas and water pollutant. You use less pesticides, which are, after all, derived from fossil fuels and both energy intensive and poisonous when used. So that can have a great benefit. Uh, and that's just a type of example that's out there. I would just simply end, though, by saying regenerative is also a concept that uh, is obviously very site dependent. It's going to be very different if you're talking apples in New York, where I live, versus corn in Missouri versus cows in Washington State. And so it's hard to give sort of one overall statement of what we should do.
Okay, that's terrific. Thank you, Peter. Just want to remind attendees that we have several links for you to check out in the chat. So if you would mind checking those out before we end. This is also another pre-submitted question. So this is I didn't leave a name, but it's I read your book. I was disheartened to learn how many obstacles farmers are confronted with in the United States. Have things gotten better since your book was written? Are attitudes changing in the commercial world that would increase business support? And has How Good and Kiss the Ground made the movement stronger? Just nine
A lot of
questions for you
issues
right
there.
there.
Um, so I think the reality is obviously the Trump administration has taken us far backwards on all of this very, very quickly. And I think the question might be, before the Trump administration, did we see some forward progress? And I'd like to think the answer is yes. Bit by bit, organic agriculture was growing. There was growing interest in regenerative agriculture, whatever it meant. People were thinking, I sort of want to buy food that's good for the environment. And consumer surveys showed that people did care and were willing to pay more for food that was good for the environment. And so that's good news. The bad news is that the frankly current conventional industrial ag lobby is very, very powerful, one of the most powerful on Capitol Hill. They are not that interested in change. And they control what happens even before the change of administration to the Trump team. And so I think right now we are facing a real big step backwards. As I mentioned earlier, what Brooke Rollins has just announced today is a good example of going backwards on grazing. We've had ever since we started grazing out west 150 years ago, it's been acknowledged that we're overgrazing, causing a lot of erosion and water quality problems. And we've struggled to address that. And now what little we do to address it is going to be reduced, it seems, by the administration. I think on the other hand, webinars like this are super important. There are climate activists that do care. And perhaps like people on this call, most of the energy has always been on fossil fuels. Very important. I'm a big fan of renewable energy. But here, by the way, there's some intersection. The US Department of Agriculture used to give a tremendous amount of support for clean renewable energy on farmland. Farmers love renewable energy. It helps, they've got energy, and if they can have solar panels or a windmill, it's great to help them both on their own operations, and it might be an important additional income source so they can, that would be much steadier than the up and down of agricultural income. And yet the current Department of Agriculture is cutting support for renewable energy, solar and wind energy on farmland. So we're going backwards now, which is very unfortunate. And programs like How Good and Kiss the Ground are all just part of raising the awareness of the possibility of eating better. As I mentioned earlier, Sam Cass's book on from the Obama White House, I think that was a big step forward. I mean, having the First Lady and even the President talking about nutritious food is important. And we can hope that that momentum survives the current administration.
Great. Thanks, Peter. I'm going to hop to the live Q&A. We got a question from Fred. What is the future of agrivoltaics? I think I said that right.
So, yeah, that's right. That's the short answer is I don't know. The longer answer is for those who don't know, agrivoltaics are sort of putting solar panels on farmland. And you can really sort of do it in two ways, and there's not a clear line in between. You can put solar panels, and like anywhere else, you just put them out like you may have seen around. And farmland can be a good place to put them because they don't have trees, they might be near roads, they might be near utility lines, they might not flood too often. And so that can be very good. And as I mentioned earlier, they're for producing energy vastly more efficient than growing corn and soybeans and using that for energy. You know, that's a form of using our farmland for renewable energy. It's just inefficient renewable energy. Agrivoltaic says, let's try to have both some amount of farming and solar panels together. So you might lift the panels up a little bit and have grazing underneath the solar panels. Or you might intersperse solar panels with crops. And in some areas that can actually increase the productivity of the crops because, especially now with climate change and changing weather, the solar panels do what trees might have done in other circumstances, provide a bit of shade. And while some crops want a lot of sun, some crops want a little bit less sun. So you can intersperse in different ways solar and agricultural operations. I think it is a terrific opportunity. I think it's in addition to the ecological benefits, you have financial benefits. And I can say from my own operation, my own experience running a farm, if we could lease some portion of our land, usually at much higher rates, by the way, to a solar developer and get that steady income, unlike agricultural income, which, as I mentioned, is often not great and often quite variable. That can be very important for the viability of farms. It's an important additional income source. So I think we want to encourage that. The downside is that there is some amount of community opposition. I personally think a lot of it is sort of funded by the fossil fuel groups that is trying to stir up community opposition, saying, oh gosh, we can't waste any farmland for solar panels. This is terrible waste of farmland. But as I mentioned, we already waste a tremendous amount of farmland for corn and soy for ethanol and diesel. We waste a lot of farmland for animal feed that we feed to animals and is super inefficient. We waste a lot of farmland that is overgrazed and therefore very, very, very low productivity. Um, Not that that's good, we should stop wasting farmland, but using a tiny bit of farmland, 1% of our farmland maybe for solar, would be an excellent opportunity for the country. So I think we should hope that there's a great future for solar and for agrivoltaics, and that this claimed opposition does not derail it too much.
That's really interesting. I think well, one of the questions I have kind of dovetails with what with agrivoltaics, and that is to fight climate change, we need to cut fossil fuels. We need to change our agricultural policies like you've been talking about. And one of the things we talk about is restoring forests and wetlands. And in Illinois, there's a program to try to restore 30% of forests and prairie and things like that. At the same time, it's said that we need to double our food production by 2050 across the world. So that brings me to this other technology, which I've heard a little bit about, is vertical farming. Is this something that you've learned about, Peter, in your work, or is there something can you talk about this?
Sure, and I live in New York City. There's some vertical farms here. The basic idea of vertical farming, or more broadly, what's called controlled environment farming, is intense farming in, as it sounds, a controlled environment. That can be just a greenhouse, or it can actually be a big building where things are grown hydroponically or aeroponically on trays in a warehouse with LED lights. So there's a whole range of operations which fit under this. And I think one of the important things is to realize our food system is really varied. You're probably not going to grow cows in a vertical farm. On the other hand, you could grow a lot of let's say that the classic would be the leafy greens that now take up a fair amount of space. And most of the ones I eat in New York probably come from California. And those could potentially be grown very efficiently in New York and with much less transportation and much less waste along the way. So vertical farming is not, or controlled environment farming is not going to be the answer that solves everything, but it can be an important answer for some aspects of our food system. Like many others, it's an area that has had some booms and busts, and it's an area that would benefit greatly from more research, public research. And unfortunately, public research has been cut. It's probably about half of what it used to be. And it's actually one of the most cost-effective research opportunities. There was a study that found for every dollar in agricultural research, you get $20 back. And when the public research ends, unfortunately, it's either not replaced at all, or it's replaced perhaps in other countries, or it's replaced by private research, which really goes to more marketable or patentable opportunities rather than the types of knowledge that could be spread widely. So for something like vertical farming and many of these other things, I see one of the questions about precision fermentation. We should be having a lot more research into this. These are very important parts of a food future. And in answer to the question, yes, precision fermentation, cultivated meats, plant-based meats, all are should be part of the future. It's not one answer for everything. It's a varied food system. Just think about all the different things you ate today. Of course, it's going to be produced in lots of different ways. And we should be pushing all of that, just in the same way that there's lots of different types of renewable energy. Well, food system is even more varied, and we need all of these solutions.
Awesome. Thank you. Couple more questions. What percentage of crops grown for corn is for ethanol? And what would be the most efficient strategy to phase that out of production?
roughly, we grow about 90 million acres of corn in this country. And about 30 to 40 million acres of that is for ethanol. And it's a similar amount of soy. So it's a lot of land. It's about, as they were saying earlier, about 60 million acres. And it's going to go up because of the recent renewable fuel standard proposal issued by Trump's EPA, which is terrible. We've been suing over for the last couple of years. We'll probably challenge this one again, but it's a terrible mandate. The question also asks, how do we reduce it? And that is a very tough political issue. I think it is an interesting fact that even the very conservative groups that are truly financially and physically conservative, like Project 2025, an agenda with which I agree with very little. But they are dead set against the ethanol mandate. It is a government distorting mandate that increases consumer food costs, increases consumer fuel costs, causes environmental damage, tells the refiners what to do, locks us into a technology that is old and not developing the way clean energy like solar panels and electric vehicles are. If you're a true conservative, it's a terrible policy. It's also, if you're an environmentalist, it's a terrible policy. But if you're a corn landowner, it's a great policy. And those folks have a lot of political power. And so it's not clear what the pathway down is. And in an ideal world, we would have a farm subsidies that pay farmers more and make doing good things with their land better, more profitable. I mean, these are people who have good land, often know a lot about their land. We should be having them grow things that our society really needs, not things that we don't need. But that's a tough political wicket. And I think if there were a administration that were, well, let's just leave it at saying, I don't think we'll see much good progress in this administration.
Yeah, thank you.
One question I see is how to encourage farmers to include trees. I'd like to mention that because I'm an admitted tree hugger. Most of the farm subsidies have been designed around annual crops. Wheat, cotton, corn, soybean, these are annual crops, and the whole structure of our farm subsidy system really is focused on annual crops. And so the answer is we really have to rethink some of that program to make it more welcoming, make it more usable for long-term crops. Tree crops are ones that you often have to plant. They don't start producing income for 3 or 5 years, and then maybe not fully producing until 10 years, and then they last 30 or 40 years. Very different issues. And so we have to encourage that. We really need to change our whole farm safety net system to make it applicable to multi-year crops as well as annual crops. But trees would be a good thing. I should also, one other thing is, a farmer also, of course, is producing a crop that he needs to sell. And right now, it may be very hard to sell a tree crop. If you're in some parts of the country, there's no one to buy anything but corn and soybean. And so if you start growing chestnuts, or if you start growing apples, or if you start growing other perennial crops, you may have nowhere to sell it. And so that might have been the case 100 years ago when we had a more varied farm system and food production system. But now with the sort of large scale monocultures that just cover areas and that have driven out diversity, a farmer trying to put in trees might have nowhere to sell or nowhere within 600 miles. So we have to think about building a market infrastructure as well.
Thank you. That's terrific. Okay, here's another question. What do you see as the most effective way to transform cultural narratives around the food system outside of policy?
Well, I think outside of policy, policy is affected by the narrative and by sort of what we believe. Politicians respond to voters, companies respond to consumers. And so I think it's important that we all, to some extent, I think of it as taking back power at a time when especially our government is dysfunctional and many people feel that their government is not responsive to them. You can still make food choices every day. You can make food choices. And those food choices will resonate. If you buy things differently, the stores you buy from know what you're buying and they start stocking differently. I was talking to once the CEO of sort of a mid-sized supermarket chain, and he said, you know, you'd be amazed. So few people talk to our product managers that if you talk to your supermarket manager, uh, they will remember you because it's so unusual. And if you say, hey, you should be stocking more of this type of food because this is what I want, and I want some more variety, and I want fresher produce or whatever, they'll pay attention to that. So I think there's a lot that we change the food narrative by acting on it. And I think one of the things you're also seeing is the food is the biggest driver of our health. So link it to health. And in that funny area, I mean, don't get us, it's a whole separate conversation whether MAHA is the Make America Healthy movement has any either credibility or sincerity. But some, at least there, do talk about recognizing we want to have food that makes us healthy rather than food that makes us sick. And so start thinking about food as a health issue. Start thinking about food as a community issue. Our current system has really decimated rural communities. Anyone who's gone into rural areas often sees these beautiful buildings and you think, wow, this is amazing. And you realize, wow, the place was just a lot more prosperous 100 years ago. But because of the way agriculture has changed, these areas have been empty of people, of energy, of commerce. And that's in large part, because of our food system. So we could have a food system that takes into account nutrition, that takes into account rural communities, that takes into account drinking water protection, animal welfare, and maybe have a slightly different mix of foods. Uh, Certainly would have a different mix of foods, but foods that perhaps actually conform to many more of our values. So that's what we got to be talking about, a food system that hits American values. And this is an area where I at least believe that there's far less partisan divide. I mean, we all eat, we all like to eat. Our particular interests in food and cultural histories of food are not that different. We want to eat food that was raised decently and did not abuse either the people or the animals or the land it comes from. I think almost everybody believes that. So that's the conversation we need to have.
Great. Just want to do a quick time check. We are at 8:12. Peter, if you're able to stick around, we could go until 8:30 and keep answering some questions if you're available.
I'm happy. I love questions.
All right, let's do it.
I hope my answers are helpful.
No, this has been great. Thank you so much. I'll kick it off with the first question in the Q&A. How many members of Congress would you guess are supportive or even aware of these essential policies?
Um, it's a tough sled in Congress. So I think the challenge is that the folks like those of us in this call that are talking about these issues, frankly, are very few. The environmental groups don't devote much of their resources to the food system. The sustainable agriculture folks tend to be small groups that are woefully underfunded. And by contrast, the industrial agriculture lobby is very, very well funded, spend hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars lobbying and shaping a narrative, and often a very misleading narrative. I mean, you'll have people thinking our food comes from the bucolic, lovely little farms with a few cows and a few chickens and a red barn and all the rest of that. And it looks great, and you think, well, that can't be a polluter. And that, of course, has very little relationship to where your food comes from. But they're doing their darndest to make sure. So members of Congress pay attention to the squeaky wheel, as it were. And those who want a better food system, frankly, aren't squeaky enough. So I think there may be members of Congress who vaguely have heard about this, but ones who will stand up and be champions are very few, unfortunately. There's some, and we're very grateful for them, but we need a lot more of them. One of the things that I've always hoped is if you really think about the food system, a very small number of people at this point produce most of our food. It's very, very heavily concentrated. 3 or 4 companies control 80% of the beef market. Literally, 3, 4 companies, 80% of the beef market. And the actual number of farmers who produce the food is well less than 1 million. And yet we have 350 million people who are affected by our food system. We all eat. We all breathe the air. We all drink water, much of which is contaminated by current agricultural practices. So somehow, if we could change the narrative and have a farm and food policy that is good for the 350 million, not just the couple 100,000 big industrial farmers, we would have a very different food system. So we all need to speak up. Everyone has an interest in the food system. Everyone. We eat every day. And yet most of us never lobby, never say anything about the food system.
Yeah, it seems to me like we could do some trust busting in the United States in a lot of areas, especially with agriculture. It just seems there's too much power to just a few organizations, few companies, in so many areas of American society. Um, I'm curious, Peter, what do you think? Are there other countries, perhaps in Europe, perhaps in South America, who are ahead of us on this, who are adopting more of these practices and reducing beef consumption, etc.?
Well, first of all, around the world, we have one of the highest meat consumptions, and that just sort of the current American diet. It wasn't always that way. It wasn't that way certainly when I was growing up, but it's become more meat heavy. And traditionally around the world, as countries get richer, they end up eating more meat. For example, like in China, it was mostly pork, but pork consumption skyrocketed as income skyrocketed. And so diet varies by country, and also you have the cultural differences. And I think it's fair to say that in Western Europe, there's probably more awareness of the dietary impact, and probably a little ahead of the US right now without quite the polarization that we've gotten here. And some countries have been doing more. Netherlands is often held up as an example, and some of the European policies have been trying to encourage more climate-friendly farming. I think it's even before climate was an issue, or even before environment was an issue. For example, Europe also very heavily subsidizes the food system, but tends to subsidize more smaller farmers, fruits and vegetables, rather than large scale grain commodity crops. And so that means fruits and vegetables tend to be a little cheaper, a little more available. And that's, from my perspective, a good thing. I mean, it would probably be better just even within, if we spent all the same amount of money and also sent it to farm production, why don't we spend more of it on the food that's good to eat rather than the food that's not so good to eat? And so other countries do that, and we could learn from that. But there's no shining example that does it just everywhere right, unfortunately.
You got me thinking, we've been seeing a lot of the plant-based alternatives to meat. And a lot of people are doing that to kind of help switch their diet. What would you say the impact of these ultra-processed vegetarian foods are, or is?
I think it depends. Personally, I like eating plants as plants rather than converted into a hamburger looking thing. But everyone, opportunities, tastes vary. When you say impact, clearly the impact on, say, climate and water and biodiversity is going to be much less because just the simple reality is that particularly cattle are very intensive in terms of water use, climate impact, land use, biodiversity impact, you name it. And so if you are eating plants, you're going to have much lower impact for sure. And the whole range of that, some are heavily processed, some are just sort of plants ground up and put into a patty. Some veggie burgers are basically a big, portobello mushroom. So it varies tremendously, the range of how heavily processed these things are. And I think what's interesting, everyone's now getting very excited about the term ultra processed food. From what I've read, it's obviously processing itself has an impact, but by far bigger impact is that most heavily processed foods have a lot of salt, sugar, and fat in them. And so it's not the processing per se, it is what's put in them in the processing. And so it is the sugar and the salt and the fat, not the processing. So if you have a plant-based burger or tofurkey or something like that, which has been processed for sure, but does not have a lot of added sugar, a lot of added salt, a lot of added fats, then both the health and the environmental impact are going to be much less. But I can't say I'm a nutrition expert, but I think that's certainly what I've been mostly reading.
Okay, yeah. So there's a question here from Mark, um, where he's asking about biochar. He said there's a lot of articles about biochar and using that to help sequester carbon at the same time helping build up the soil, regenerate the soil. And he asks, has that idea held up?
I think so. I'll give a little boost. I don't know, it's not showing up. There it is. This is the book I wrote about when I tried to get into this. And I tried to learn a lot about this and read a lot of papers. And biochar was one of the topics. I think there's a lot of promise to it. Now, how biochar is made makes a big difference in terms of its sort of overall long-term energy balance, but it does seem that biochar, and for those who don't know, biochar is essentially charcoal made out of a biological process. Like take wood and you burn it in an oxygen-free environment, and you make the type of charcoal that you may have in your gas barbecue or in your barbecue, but it's made out of wood. And when placed in the land, it both is itself carbon and it stores a lot of carbon sticks to it. And it can actually be very good for making the soil healthier and storing a lot more carbon. And very likely, at least some studies suggest also really help in water retention. So I think overall, pretty positive. What is less clear is how to apply it how to produce it and apply it at scale. So if you have a small farm, you can spread it on a little bit of land, but we're talking, 350, 400 million acres of cropland. How do we produce that much and spread it at scale? And that I think is the challenge we've seen. And again, I would come back to R&D. When I started working on clean energy issues in the early 90s, we certainly had a lot of questions about solar energy and electric vehicles. We thought, forget it, those will never be any good. And yet we put research into that and energy into that. And now we have great, very efficient solar panels and electric vehicles that are terrific. And all of this, so that right now it's cheaper to build solar than it is to build a fossil fuel plant. And so we have to look at this as a 20, 30, 50-year transformation effort. So the question isn't, how is biochar, how is precision fermentation, or how is cultivated meat today? The question is, how can we get it to where it needs to be in 20 years?
Yep. Totally makes sense. Thinking about this other question here, which selfishly I kind of relate to because growing up in New Jersey, we actually had a small farm in my backyard, and my parents did this because of the tax benefits. So I'd love to hear from your perspective how tax policy could impact food production and consumption.
Lots of different ways. Tax policy can affect everything. And I won't pretend to be an expert at it. But what I can say is that the US Department of Agriculture every few years does a census of agriculture, and it finds that there's about 2 million farmers according to this. And the number has gone down, and sometimes we say, oh, isn't that terrible? The number's going down. But what's really the case is the whole thing is a little misleading. Of the maybe 2 million farmers, an estimated half of those farmers are essentially tax farmers or hobby farmers, retired farmers. They're lifestyle farmers. They like the farm. They're getting tax breaks because largely agricultural land doesn't have property taxes or pays very low property taxes. So if you like your land, you keep a few cows on them or you grow a little bit, and you actually don't care if you make any money because you're saving so much money on the tax break, and you like the field. And there's nothing particularly wrong with that, but we should know that for many of those, local governments are very heavily subsidizing sort of lifestyle, not actually food production. Uh, so, and that's, they're entitled to do that. Most local governments, and that's pretty widely done. And there are estimates that the property tax break for agriculture is on the order of 50 to $100 billion a year. So if you think that the federal farm bill pays farmers 20 billion a year, they potentially the benefit they get from this property tax break is many times bigger. But right now, I don't think that's the real driver. The part of the driver, I would say, perhaps a bigger one, is that many young people and those who've been excluded from farming would love to get into farming, but it's hard to get farmland. They're not making a lot more of it. And so you have to buy farmland from somebody who is on it. Now, a lot of American farmland is rented. In other words, the owner of the land isn't actually operating the farm. About half of farmland is rented. And on one hand, that's fine, big deal. On the other hand, that's in part there because we've had so many tax breaks to make it very easy for people who no longer are operating their farmland to keep their farmland and think of it as an asset, no different from stocks and bonds. And on the one hand, you can say that's fine. On the other hand, since we're not making any more land, it means a young farmer or a new farmer, it's very hard to buy farmland. There's not much for sale. And so tax policy provides really disincentives for landowners who are getting out of the business, which are many of them. The average farmer is, I think, somewhere around 60 years old, and many of their children have moved on and don't want to be farmers. But in one world, they might sell their land to somebody who wants to farm it. But now they think, I might as well keep it, and it's, pay me a dividend and rent every year and no big deal. And that makes sense to them, but it does mean the new farmer can't get access to new land. So I think that's one of the tax policy implications that people are looking at more closely.
Yeah. Great. Well, I think that just about brings us to time. This was absolutely wonderful. So many great questions. Thank you, everyone who attended. I'm going to close us out. Really appreciate, once again, everyone being here. If you're interested in learning more about this topic, we recommend you buy Peter's book, Farming for Our Future. The link is in the chat. Before we go, we'd also like you to take action on two very important topics. The links are also in the chat. First is the petition to tell Congress, protect our state food laws. Do not block food chemical laws. We need stronger protections, not giveaways, written by and for the chemical industry. This is a direct attack on states' rights and food safety. Urge them to defend states' ability to protect their communities and uphold the right to safer food. The second petition is tell Congress do not overturn local pesticide laws. Urgent action is needed to help stop the spread of toxic pesticides. Despite the science linking dangerous pesticides like glyphosate, and neonics to life-threatening health conditions like cancer, Bayer's Monsanto and other corporations are determined to throw out all state and local regulations just to protect their profit margins. Also, please be sure to visit Earthjustice Sustainable Food and Farming Program. Link is in the chat. And to get more involved, visit our website for further information. I'd like to give a special thanks to Rich for joining us, our co-sponsor 350 Chicago, and Rich will close us out.
Thank you, Rebecca. Well done. Peter, thank you. This was one of the most informative webinars I've attended on this topic, and it's a favorite topic of mine. I think that if we were to follow Peter's outline, his proposals, I think we would not only address we would address several problems. We would help farmers. We would have healthier food. We would address the climate crisis. So I think this is just win-win all around, win-win-win. I don't know how many wins. So yeah, I encourage everybody to get involved. And when I say get involved, that doesn't mean I have to make it your life like some of us do. Um, Sign the petitions, reach out to your congressman, reach out to your local state representatives. I think that's really important to remember the state officials. There's so much we can get done at the state level, especially in this second age of Trump. And I just, one thing I want to mention too, I said it in the chat, is you can buy from farmers who are trying to make these changes and implement them. And that could be very helpful and help them succeed. So I'd just like to thank Peter again. Rebecca, thank you all of you over at 350 New York. Thank Earth Justice. And I just encourage you too to, when you receive the video, share what you've learned here with other people. That's a great way to help make change occur, help change that narrative. And I think, the holidays are just around the corner. I think it will be a really nice Christmas present to get everybody in your life Peter's book. What do you think?
I agree.
We can get Peter with all that money. Peter can get a trip to Italy or something, right? So-
Love it. Great idea. Once again,
you're muted, Peter.
I said, one does not write a book like this for the financial reward.
Yeah, I write poetry, so I know what you're talking about.
Exactly. But it is, many people, it is very informative. There's a lot of footnotes. It's pretty wonky, but that's what maybe many in this call are, because we want to be effective. So I think it gives you the information to be effective. But mostly, thank you to all of you for listening. That's really important. And please spread the word. There's so many environmental advocates and climate advocates. And as I said, we all need to pay a lot more attention to the food system.
Thank you very much. Have a good night, everybody. We'll see you soon.